Again he paused, fearing that his bluntness might have offended Arthur. But Arthur was never a man to evade responsibility, and he nodded his reluctant agreement with Tudric's frankness. "While we," Tudric continued, "fight to keep the oath we gave to High King Uther, an oath by which we promised to preserve Mordred's throne. I, for one, will not break that oath. Nor I," Arthur said loudly. "But what, Lord Arthur, if King Gorfethid has no designs on that throne?" King Tudric asked. "If he means to keep Mordred as king, then why do we fight?" There was uproar in the hall. We Dumnonians smelled treachery. The men of Gwent smelled an escape from the war, and for a time we shouted at each other, until at last Arthur regained order by slapping his hand on the table. "The last envoy I sent to Gorfethid," Arthur said, "had his head sent back in a sack. Are you suggesting, Lord King, we send another?" Tudric shook his head. "Gorfethid is refusing to receive my envoys. They are turned back at the frontier. But if we wait here and let his army waste its efforts against our walls, then I believe he will become discouraged, and will then negotiate." His men murmured agreement. Arthur tried one more time to dissuade Tudric. He conjured a picture of our army rooted behind walls, while Gorfethid's horde ravaged the newly harvested farms. But the men of Gwent would not be moved by his oratory or his passion. They only saw outflanked shield walls and fields of dead men, and so they seized on their king's belief that peace would come if only they retreated into Magnus and let Gorfethid weary his men by battering its strong walls. They began to demand Arthur's agreement for their strategy, and I saw the hurt on his face. He had lost. If he waited here, then Gorfethid would demand his head. If he ran to Armorica, he would live, but he would be abandoning Mordred and his own dream of a just, united Britain. The clamour in the hall grew louder, and it was then that Galahad stood and shouted for a chance to be heard. Tudric pointed at Galahad, who first introduced himself. "I am Galahad, Lord King," he said, "a prince of Benwick. If King Gorfethid will receive no envoys from Gwent or Dumnonia, then surely he will not refuse one from Armorica. Let me go, Lord King, to Caer Seuss, and inquire what Gorfethid intends to do with Mordred. And if I do go, Lord King, will you accept my word as to his verdict?" Tudric was happy to accept. He was happy with anything that might avert war, but he was still anxious for Arthur's agreement. "Suppose Gorfethid decrees that Mordred is safe," he suggested to Arthur. "What will you do then?" Arthur stared at the table. He was losing his dream, but he could not tell a lie to save that dream, and so he looked up with a rueful smile. "In that case, Lord King, I would leave Britain, and I would entrust Mordred to your keeping." Once again we Dumnonians shouted our protests, but this time Tudric silenced us. "We do not know what answer Prince Galahad will bring," he said. "But this I promise. If Mordred's throne is threatened, then I, King Tudric, will fight. If not, I see no reason to fight." And with that promise we had to be content. The war, it seemed, hung on Gorfethid's answer. To find it, next morning, Galahad rode north. I rode with Galahad. He had not wanted me to come, saying that my life would be in danger, but I argued with him as I had never argued before. I also pleaded with Arthur, saying that at least one Dumnonian should hear Gorfethid declare his intentions about our king, and Arthur pleaded my case with Galahad, who at last relented. We were friends, after all, though for my own safety Galahad insisted that I travel as his servant, and that I carry his symbol on my shield. "You have no symbol," I told him. "I do now," he said. and ordered that our shields be painted with crosses. "Why not?" he asked me. "I'm a Christian." "It looks wrong," I said. I was accustomed to warriors' shields being blazoned with bulls, eagles, dragons, and stags, not with some desiccated piece of religious geometry. "I like it," he said. "And besides, you are now my humble servant, Derval, so your opinion is of no interest to me. None." He laughed and skipped away from a blow I aimed at his arm. I was forced to ride to Kersús. In all my years with Arthur, I never did accustom myself to sitting on a horse's back. To me, it always seemed a natural thing to sit well back on a horse, but sitting thus, it was impossible to grip the animal's flanks with your knees, for which you had to slide forward until you were perched just behind its neck, with your feet dangling in the air behind its forelegs. In the end, I used to tuck one foot into the saddle girth to give me an anchoring point, a shift that offended Galahad, who was proud of his horsemanship. "Ride it properly," he would say. "But there's nowhere to put my feet." "The horse has got 4. How many more do you want?" We rode to Caer Lud, Gorfythid's major fortress in the border hills. The town stood on a hill in a river bend, and we reckoned its sentries would be less wary than those who guarded the Roman road at Lug Vale. Even so, we did not state our real business in Powys, but simply declared ourselves as landless men from Armorica seeking entry into Gorfythid's country. The guards, discovering Galahad was a prince, insisted on escorting him to the town's commander, and so led us through the town that was filled with armed men, whose spears were stacked at every door, and whose helmets were piled under all the tavern benches. The town commander was a harassed man who plainly hated the responsibilities of governing a garrison swollen by the imminence of war. "I knew you must be from Armorica when I saw your shields, Lord Prince," he told Galahad. "An outlandish symbol to our provincial eyes." "An honoured one in mine," Galahad said gravely, not catching my eye. To be sure, the commander said. His name was Halsid. "And of course you are welcome, Lord Prince. Our High King is welcoming all." He paused, embarrassed. He had been about to say that Gorfythid was welcoming all landless warriors, but that phrase cut too close to insult when uttered to a dispossessed prince of an Armorican kingdom. "All brave men," the commander said instead. "You were not thinking of staying here by any chance?" He was worried that we would prove 2 more hungry mouths in a town already hard-pressed to feed its existing garrison. "I would ride to Kersús," Galahad announced, "with my servant." He gestured towards me. "May the gods speed your path, Lord Prince." And thus we entered the enemy country. We rode through quiet valleys where newly stooked corn patterned the fields, and orchards hung heavy with ripening apples. The next day we were among the hills, following an earth road that wound through great tracts of damp woodland, until at last we climbed above the trees and crossed the pass that led down to Gorfythid's capital. I felt a shudder of nerves as I saw Kersús's raw earth walls. Gorfythid's army might be gathering in Branogenium, some 40 miles away, but still the land around Kersús was thick with soldiers. The troops had thrown up crude shelters with walls of stone roofed with turf, and the shelters surrounded the fort that flew 8 banners from its walls, to show that the men of 8 kingdoms served in Gorfythid's growing ranks. 8? Galahad asked. Powys, Siluria, Elmet, but who else? Cornovia, Demetia, Gwynedd, Cherreged, and Demetia's Blackshields, I said, finishing off the grim list. No wonder Tudric wants peace, Galahad said softly, marvelling at the host of men camped on either side of the river that ran beside the enemy's capital. We rode down into that hive of iron. Children followed us, curious about our strange shields, while their mothers watched us suspiciously from the shadowed openings of their shelters. The men gave us brief glances, taking in our strange insignia and noting the quality of our weapons. But none challenged us until we reached the gates of Kersús, where Gorfythid's royal guard barred our way with polished spearheads. "I am Galahad, Prince of Benwick," Galahad announced grandly. "Come to see my cousin, the High King." "Is he a cousin?" I whispered. "It's how we royalty talk," he whispered back. The scene inside the compound went some way to explaining why so many soldiers were gathered at Caersus. 3 tall stakes had been driven into the earth, and now waited for the formal ceremonies that preceded war. Powys was one of the least Christian kingdoms, and the old rituals were done carefully here, and I suspected that many of the soldiers camped outside the walls had been fetched back from Brenogenium specifically to witness the rites, and so to inform their comrades that the gods had been placated. There was to be nothing hasty about Gorfythid's invasion. Everything would be done methodically, and Arthur, I thought, was probably right in thinking that such a pedestrian endeavour could be tipped off balance by a surprise attack. Our horses were taken by servants. Then, after a counsellor had questioned Galahad and determined that he was indeed who he claimed to be, we were ushered into the great feasting hall. The doorkeeper took our swords, shields, and spears, and added them to the stacks of similar weapons belonging to the men already gathered in Gorfythid's hall. Over 100 men were assembled between the squat oak pillars that were hung with human skulls to show that the kingdom was at war. The men beneath those grinning bones were the kings, princes, lords, chiefs, and champions of the assembled armies. The only furniture in the hall was the row of thrones placed on a dais at the far dark end, where Gorfythid sat beneath his symbol of the eagle, while next to him, but on a lower throne, sat Gunlius. The very sight of the Silurian king made the scar on my left hand pulse. Tanabers squatted beside Gunlius, while Gorfythid had Eorwith, his own druid, at his right side. Keenaglas, Powys's edling, sat on a third throne, and was flanked by kings I did not recognize. No women were present. This was doubtless a council of war, or at least a chance for men to gloat over the victory that was about to be theirs. The men were dressed in mail coats and leather armour. We paused at the back of the hall, and I saw Galahad mouth a silent prayer to his god. A wolfhound, with a chewed ear and scarred haunches, sniffed our boots, then loped back to its master, who stood with the other warriors on the rush-covered earth floor. In a far corner of the hall, a bard softly chanted a war song, though his staccato recitation was ignored by the men who were listening to Gunlius describing the forces he expected to come from Demetia. One chief, evidently a man who had suffered from the Irish in the past, protested that Powys had no need of the Blackshield's help to defeat Arthur and Tudric, but his protest was stilled by an abrupt gesture from Gorfythid. I half expected that we would be forced to linger while the council finished its other business, but we did not have to wait more than a minute before we were conducted down the hall's centre to the open space in front of Gorfythid. I looked at both Gunlius and Tanabers, but neither recognized me. We fell to our knees and waited. "Arise," Gorfythid said. We obeyed, and once again I looked into his bitter face. He had not changed much in the years since I had seen him last. His face was as pouchy and suspicious as when Arthur had come to claim Cynwyn's hand, though his sickness in the last few years had turned his hair and beard white. The beard was skimpy, and could not hide a goiter that now disfigured his throat. He looked at us warily. "Galahad," he said in a hoarse voice, "Prince of Benwick, we have heard of your brother Lancelot, but not of you. Are you, like your brother, one of Arthur's whelps?" "I am oath-bound to no man, Lord King," Galahad said, "except to my father, whose bones were trampled by his enemies. I am landless,